Okay, so thanks for the invitation to come and speak. So I guess my job is to try and be as provocative as possible as we lead into questions. The exam question we've been set is this question: is the ref leading or lagging? And the spoiler alert is that I'm going to say at the end that I believe it is technically leading. It's thoughtfully put together, very well considered. The question I want to pose is, where is it leading? And should we be questioning that a little bit more? And I think there's something really interesting embedded in this question, because if we're leading or lagging, that implies, as I think people have alluded to, that there's a single road. There's a single path and a single direction. And that seems a rather problematic concept in our current world for a lot of reasons. So I want to unpack that a little by focusing on this question of excellence. So Gemma made an interesting assertion. She said, we all know what a 4-star paper looks like. And that's true. Researchers, each of us individually, we all absolutely know what a 4-star paper looks like. We also absolutely know that the person next to us disagrees with us. And at the same time, as Stephen said, we respect the process by which these peers that we disagree with coming to a conclusion about, at least at some aggregate level, the sense of the value of a body of work. And that's a really interesting contradiction. So how can we tease that apart? And I think I want to pick on this term excellence in particular. It's the centre of the name of the ref. And it's the centre of a piece of work that myself with Martin Eve, who's in the audience, Damien Patterson, Sam Moore, and who have I left out? Dan O'Donnell, wrote in a preprint, which you can read and critique. It's 18,000 words, so I'm not going to try and run through that in 8 minutes. The central argument we make is exactly what I've just said, that we all share the notion that excellence is something that's important, and we articulate a notion that it's a shared value, and yet we at the same time recognise that it's not. That in fact it's trying to mean far too many things for it to mean anything. And I could go through examples from university mission statements or different sort of sets of assessments and show you how we very carefully often avoid defining excellence when we talk about it, particularly in the sort of general sense. But I'll give you a very concrete example. If the TEF is strongly based on the National Student Survey, then the universities that come out of that are going to be Buckingham, Keele, and a bunch of others that are not the ones we traditionally see at the top of the ref. And yet the political thing that's coming down from the top is an assumption that we're going to use this, for instance, to allocate easy rides for student visas to the top institutions. And I'm not entirely sure how government's going to respond when the answer to what are the top teaching institutions turns out to be entirely different to all of the expectations of the people who have based all of their assumptions on the excellence of research institutions, not least because they went to university at those and did PPE there. So we have a problem here in that we're trying to articulate something that is complex and multifaceted. And we're doing this in a social context in which we're trying to negotiate complex political issues around resource allocation. So we need some sort of shared sense, some sort of shared thing to work around. And excellence and quality and impact are amongst the things that we've agreed to quietly shelve the conversation about what it is we actually mean by those things in general conversation. And so this may or may not be a problem, at least in the sense of needing a system of resource allocation and political agreement, because we have to find something to aggregate around. And I should say, and this is why I think the ref is actually in many ways leading, if you look very closely at the rubric for the ref and how quality and excellence are defined, you actually don't find those words appearing very frequently at all in the details of how the assessment is being conducted, how it is being evaluated. There's much more specificity. There's much more context being provided in how those questions are being decided. And that's great. And I think that reflects, as we've heard, 30 years of very careful thinking about how to avoid some of the potential problems of having very different conversations. But at the academic level, as we sit on the outside, and I'm in a slightly interesting space. I work at a Australian university, so I'm subject to the Australian research evaluation system. And I live in the UK, and my wife is at the University of Bath and subject to the UK research evaluation system. So we see these two things operating in a really interesting fashion. Again, the Australian system is almost set up to create adverse circumstances because it is too focused on metrics, too focused on lists, too focused on very linear thought processes around what is better than the next thing. It also, we can get into some of the technical issues, requires a submission of all outputs. It requires all of them to go into particular subject codes, which are far too narrow. So there's a bunch of technical things we could talk about there. But I want to focus on this question of excellence and what it tells us. We have a social agreement, despite the fact that we don't really know what we mean by it. We have a strong sense that we want to be excellent, sort of motherhood and apple pie statement of the academic world. Is that a problem? Is that a problem? If we're all striving towards slightly different conceptions of these things, is it a problem? And I would argue that it probably wouldn't be, except for another factor about the way these things are set up. And Gunnar's alluded to this when he talked about the Stern Review focusing on different aspects. Something really interesting happens when you create a linear scale and judge people on it and then reward the top 5, 10 or 20%. Quite a lot of research shows that what happens under those circumstances is you end up with performance of what people think they're supposed to be doing. You get performance of excellence rather than excellent performance. Now, a lot of this work has been done looking at the performance of preschoolers in educational settings, so it's immediately applicable to academics, clearly. We're all human, and it's actually a remarkably similar setting. That question of who gets the gold star for the week is not actually different, and in many ways is statistically similar to the question of whether you get the grant, whether your department survives, where your university falls on these rankings. And so I think, coming back to this original point, where are we being led? Well, we're being led into a world in which we're all chasing this thing which we trust other people to evaluate despite not actually trusting them to evaluate it. And in using words like excellence and quality and impact, we avoid the really difficult political discussions, or we bury them one layer down in these technical consultations as to what it is we actually care about. What is the Academy for? What is the public investment for? And how do different institutions, again, to Gunnar's point, how are institutions performing on their mission? How are researchers doing different work that has impacts of different types for different communities in different ways? Each excellent in their own way, each excellent from the perspective of the researcher who set their own goals, set their own sense of what they want to achieve, or the sense of a user community and what the user community is looking for from the process of this research. If we continue to focus funds, resources and prestige on the top 5% or 10% or 20%, depending on our success rates and our resource allocations, we are going to end up with a sort of lowest common denominator of the highest common denominator. What does an excellent researcher look like? They look like a grey-haired man receiving the Nobel Prize for doing work on curing the medical problems of rich Americans. That's maybe over-egging it slightly, but it's not a diverse group of people doing a diverse group of research. And so the question comes, I think, and all of the speakers, I think, have alluded to this question, that if we're trying to evaluate a rich, complex social system for how it is delivering a very rich set of outcomes, if I could change one thing in the REF, it would be to remove the separation between impact and outputs. They're all, whether it's academic impact or other impact, it's all the effects this research is having in the outside world. And I'd love it to live in a world where researchers could individually, or at level of departments, faculties, missions, communities, make the case that what they were doing was interesting in some specific way for some specific purpose. That the primary care researcher could make the choice between publishing a YouTube video intended for the education of nurses versus publishing an academic paper. So that's the question I think that's before us. I mean, we should get down to the detail. We should ask these questions because they're important questions. And as Gemma has alluded to, little details, what order you do the meeting in, can have profound effects on this construction of what it is that we're looking for, which is social and local and difficult to negotiate. So the detail matters, but I think we should also keep our eye on this larger question of what is it that we're actually doing this for? And systemically, how can we build systems that support a diverse range of different institutions and different researchers doing different things that contribute to society in different ways?